Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Now, I want you to close your eyes for a moment. Actually, you know what? Keep them open if you're driving. But imagine this with me. You're about to take a journey that's going to completely change how you see the world around you. We're going back, way back, 400 million years back to be exact. And trust me, you're not going to believe what Earth looked like then. Picture this. You're standing there, and the first thing that hits you isn't what you see, it's what you feel. Your lungs are burning. Actually burning, like you've just sprinted up a mountain except you haven't moved an inch. You're gasping, trying to catch your breath, and here's why the air around you contains just 15% oxygen. Think about that for a second. Today, we're used to 21% oxygen in every breath we take. That's 6% difference. It's the difference between breathing normally and feeling like you're suffocating. Your chest is heaving as you struggle to pull enough oxygen from this thin, alien atmosphere. Every breath is work. Every breath reminds you that you are very, very far from home. And that's just the beginning of this nightmare paradise you've stumbled into. Now lift your head and look around. The sky above you and I want you to really picture this isn't blue. It's purple. Not a soft lavender purple like a pretty sunset, but this weird unsettling purple tinge that makes everything feel wrong somehow. It's like someone took the sky, and ran it through a filter that doesn't quite exist yet. The atmospheric conditions are so different from what you're used to that light itself behaves differently here. You're standing on solid ground, which is something, I suppose. But as your eyes adjust to this strange new world, you realize that solid ground is being pretty generous. Beneath your feet stretches bare rock, just rock. Miles and miles of grey, brown and reddish stone extending in every direction like some kind of alien moonscape. There's no soft grass to cushion your steps, no dandelions poking up through sidewalk cracks, no grass at all actually, because grass won't exist for another 250 million years. Here's what's really going to mess with your head. You're looking at Earth. This is our planet. This is home, just 400 million years before you were born. You're standing in the middle of the Paleozoic era, specifically the fourth period of that era, and the world that gave birth to every living thing you've ever known looks like it belongs in a science fiction movie. The continents aren't where you remember them being, either. If you could somehow see the whole planet from space, you'd notice that most of the land masses are clustered down near the equator, forming this massive southern supercontinent that geologists call Gondwana. It's like someone took all the pieces of the puzzle that would eventually become the continents and smooshed them together in completely the wrong places. What will one day be Africa is snuggled up against South America. Australia is nowhere near where you'd expect it. And where you're standing right now, this is going to blow your mind. You're on something called the Old Red Continent, a massive landmass that will eventually break apart to become North America and Europe. But let's get back to where you are, right now, trying to make sense of this alien landscape. You start walking, your feet crunching on loose rock and what might generously be called primitive soil. As you explore, you notice there are some signs of life here and there, but they're nothing like what you're used to. Hugging the edges of streams and in the dampest areas, you spot these low, spongy patches of green. These are the most advanced plants on land, primitive, moss-like, things that barely qualify as plants by your standards. They're clinging to life in the few places where water gathers, creating these tiny oases of green in an otherwise barren world. And then you see them, these weird, alien-looking structures poking up from the ground like tiny umbrellas or bizarre little clubs. They're only a few inches tall, these strange growths, but you're looking at something absolutely revolutionary. These are Cooksonia, and they represent one of life's greatest achievements. These unassuming little plants are Earth's first vascular plants, the first living things to figure out how to move water upward against gravity using specialized tissue. They're the distant ancestors of every tree, every flower, every blade of grass that will ever exist. But even with these pioneering plants scattered around, the overwhelming impression is of emptiness, desolation. This is a world that feels unfinished, like someone started a painting and then walked away before adding any of the details that make it feel alive. Speaking of feeling alive, here's something that's going to really get under your skin: the silence. Have you ever been somewhere truly quiet? I mean really, truly quiet? This is quieter. There are no birds singing because there are no birds. Period. Birds won't evolve for another 150 million years. There are no insects buzzing around because insects haven't figured out how to live on land yet. No mammals scurrying through underbrush because mammals are still 350 million years in the future. No amphibians croaking in hidden ponds because amphibians are just beginning their first tentative experiments with this whole living on land thing. The only sounds you hear are the wind, and it's a strange wind, carrying scents and particles you can't identify, and the distant crash of waves against shores that will one day become Scotland, New York, and Australia. Sometimes you might hear the rumble of rock falling, or the weird groaning and settling sounds that rocks make when they expand and contract with temperature changes. But no animal sounds. None. It's like the entire planet is holding its breath. And about those temperature changes, it's hot here. Really hot. The temperature is hovering around 85 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's not just hot, it's consistently hot. There's no real winter coming, no cool relief. The reason for this perpetual heat wave: carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are 15 times higher than what you're used to. 15 times. The greenhouse effect is running in overdrive, turning Earth into a giant terrarium. You wipe sweat from your forehead and squint into the distance, where something catches your eye. Mountains. But these aren't peaceful, ancient mountains worn smooth by millions of years of erosion. These are young, angry mountains, and they're still growing. Volcanic peaks jut up into that purple sky, and even from miles away, you can see them spewing ash and steam into the atmosphere. This is the Devonian period, and it's a tectonically violent time. The Caledonian Mountains are rising right before your eyes as continents collide with unimaginable force. The ground beneath your feet occasionally trembles, not enough to knock you down, but enough to remind you that this planet is still very much under construction. Massive geological forces are reshaping continents, building mountains, opening and closing ocean basins. You're witnessing the birth of landscapes, the violent creation of the foundation that will one day support cities and forests and farms. But here's the thing that's really going to mess with your mind. This isn't some distant alien planet we're talking about. This is Earth. Your Earth. The same planet where you learned to ride a bike, where you went to school, where you fell in love for the first time. Every atom in your body was forged in stars that shone down on this exact landscape. The oxygen, if you're struggling to breathe, was first produced by primitive plants, not too different from those tiny Cooksonia sprouting around your feet. You are standing on your family tree. This harsh alien landscape is where your story begins. Not your personal story, obviously, but the story of everything that made your existence possible. Somewhere in this seemingly lifeless world, evolution is conducting the greatest experiments in the history of life on Earth. In shallow coastal waters just over the horizon, fish with the first primitive limbs are learning to drag themselves onto muddy shores. The first forests are beginning to take shape, even though they would look absolutely nothing like the forests you know. This is your heritage. This nightmare paradise of bare rock, purple skies, and thin air is where the characteristics that make you human first began to develop. The backbone that holds you upright, the limbs that let you walk, the lungs that are working so hard to extract oxygen from this alien atmosphere. All of these features are products of evolutionary experiments happening right here, right now, in this strange and hostile world. And the most incredible part? This is just the beginning of our story. What you're experiencing, this struggle to breathe, this harsh and seemingly lifeless landscape, this is actually one of the most important chapters in the history of life on Earth. The Devonian period, the time you've found yourself in, is when life makes its great leap from water to land. It's when the foundation is laid for every ecosystem you've ever known. The silence around you isn't empty, it's pregnant with possibility. Those tiny plants at your feet aren't just surviving, they're revolutionizing the planet. The bare rock stretching to the horizon isn't lifeless. It's a blank canvas waiting for life to write its greatest masterpiece. You take another labored breath of that thin alien air, and suddenly you realize something incredible. You're not just witnessing the past, you're witnessing the moment when your future became possible. Every breath you've ever taken, every step you've ever walked, every green thing you've ever seen, it all starts here, in this purple-skied world of rock and pioneer plants and endless, pregnant silence. And trust me, what happens next is going to absolutely blow your mind. Because while this land may seem empty and lifeless, just beyond those rocky shores lies an ocean teeming with creatures so bizarre, so magnificent, and so terrifying that they make the monsters in your worst nightmares look like house pets. But that's a story for next time. Now, I know what you're thinking after hearing about that alien landscape. You're probably wondering where all the action is, right? Well, let me tell you something that's going to give you chills while that land might seem empty and lifeless. Just beyond those rocky shores lies an ocean that would make your worst nightmares look like a pleasant dream. Picture yourself standing on one of those bare shorelines, looking out at waves that crash against rocks with a sound you've never heard before because the chemistry of these ancient seas is completely different from any ocean you know. The water has this slightly greenish tint, and it's warm, really warm, like bath water that's been sitting in the sun all day. And beneath those waves, that's where evolution has been going absolutely crazy, crafting creatures so bizarre and terrifying that they make Jaws look like a children's movie. Let me introduce you to the undisputed king of these ancient seas. His name is Dunkleosteus Torelli, and trust me, you're going to want to remember that name. Picture this: 33 feet of pure armored death cutting through the water with the efficiency of a torpedo and the appetite of a shark that's been fasting for a month. But here's the thing that's really going to mess with you. This isn't some primitive, clumsy, prehistoric monster. This is a precision killing machine that evolution spent millions of years perfecting. Dunkleosteus was discovered by a guy named David Dunkel, hence the name, back in 1867 along Cleveland's Rocky River. Dunkel was just a regular geologist poking around in the rocks, probably thinking he'd find a nice fossil shell or maybe some ancient coral. Instead, he uncovered pieces of what would turn out to be one of the most fearsome predators that ever lived. And here's the wild part: we didn't even realize what we'd found for decades. It took 50 years of careful study before paleontologists figured out they were looking at the ultimate apex predator of the ancient seas. Now, when I tell you this thing had a bite force of 11,000 pounds per square inch, I want you to really think about what that means. A great white shark, you know, the one from Jaws that still gives people nightmares, has a bite force of about 4,000 pounds per square inch. Dunkleosteus had nearly 3 times that power. But here's where it gets really creepy: it didn't even have teeth. Instead of teeth, Dunkleosteus had these massive bone plates in its jaws that sharpened themselves every time it bit down. Imagine the biggest, sharpest garden shears you've ever seen, except they're the size of dinner tables, and they're designed to slice through anything that gets between them. These weren't just cutting tools, they were precision instruments of destruction that could scissor through bone like it was butter. There's this incredible fossil from the Cleveland Shale that tells one of the most amazing stories I've ever heard. Scientists found a Dunkleosteus that had apparently choked to death. Choked to death. Can you imagine? This ultimate predator, this master of the ancient seas, died because it bit off more than it could chew, literally. Stuck in its throat was a 14-foot shark. Think about that for a second. This thing was so confident, so dominant, that it tried to swallow a 14-foot shark whole. Even apex predators had bad days in the Devonian. But Dunkleosteus wasn't swimming around in empty oceans. Oh no, these seas were absolutely teeming with life, and I mean teeming. Let me paint you a picture of what else was sharing the water with our armoured friend. First, you've got the early sharks. Now, when I say early sharks, I don't want you thinking of some primitive, clumsy ancestor that barely knew how to swim. These were sleek, efficient killing machines that had already figured out the basic design that would carry their descendants through every single mass extinction Earth would ever see. Cladocellaceae was about 7 feet long, and looking at its fossils, you can see that evolution had already nailed the streamlined body shape, the powerful tail, the perfect balance of speed and maneuverability that makes sharks such incredible hunters. Here's what blows my mind about these early sharks. They were already perfect. Not perfect in the sense that they couldn't be improved, but perfect in the sense that they'd found a design so efficient, so effective, that their basic body plan would survive unchanged for 400 million years. While continents moved, while climates changed, while countless other species rose and fell, sharks just kept being sharks. They'd already cracked the code. But wait, there's more. Sharing these ancient seas were creatures that looked like they crawled out of a science fiction movie. Eurypterids, also known as sea scorpions. And when I say sea scorpions, I want you to forget everything you think you know about scorpions. These weren't little desert creatures hiding under rocks. Jacalopterus, the largest eurypterid, reached 8 feet in length. 8 feet of armored predator, with paddle-like limbs for swimming and claws that could snap a grown person in half. Picture one of these things coming at you through murky water, its compound eyes tracking your every movement, its massive claws extended like some kind of underwater tank with weapons. These weren't just big, they were smart, sophisticated hunters that ruled the shallow seas and estuaries where fresh water met salt water. They were like underwater wolves, pack hunters that could coordinate attacks and work together to bring down prey much larger than themselves. And speaking of things that would give you nightmares, let's talk about the trilobites. Now, I know what you're thinking. Trilobites are those cute little segmented fossils you see in museums, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. Some Devonian trilobites were absolutely massive, and they came in varieties that would blow your mind. Take Terataspis grandis, and that name, by the way, literally means giant monster shield. This thing was 2 feet long and built like an underwater tank. But here's what's really incredible about trilobites, their eyes. Some species had compound eyes with up to 15,000 individual lenses. 15,000? That's more than most modern insects. They could see movement, detect polarized light, and spot prey or predators with incredible accuracy. But it wasn't just about the monsters. These ancient seas were also home to some of the most beautiful creatures ever to grace our planet. Massive coral reefs stretched across the ocean floor, but these weren't like modern coral reefs. These were built by horn corals, creatures that looked like ice cream cones made of living rock, each one creating its own individual limestone tower. When I say these reefs were massive, I mean massive. They covered more area than coral reefs have ever covered before or since. Imagine underwater cities stretching for thousands of miles, built not by humans, but by tiny animals that extracted calcium carbonate from seawater and turned it into living architecture. These weren't just reefs, they were entire ecosystems, underwater metropolises that supported thousands of different species. Swimming through these, coral cities were crinoids, sea lilies that weren't plants at all, but animals that looked like underwater flowers swaying in the current. Brachiopods carpeted the seafloor like underwater clams, filtering nutrients from the water and creating the foundation of complex food webs. And everywhere you looked, there were these incredible spiraled shells called nautiloids, some of them reaching 15 feet in length, jet-propelling themselves through the water like living submarines. But here's where our story gets personal, and I mean really personal. Swimming through these alien seas were our ancestors, not our distant cousins or some vaguely related creatures, our actual ancestors. Lobe-finned fish, like Eusthenopteron, were developing something that would change the course of life on Earth forever. Look at your arm for a second. Seriously, look at it. Feel your upper arm bone, that's your humerus. Now feel the two bones in your forearm, the radius and ulna. That exact bone structure, that specific arrangement, first appeared in the fins of lobe-finned fish swimming in Devonian seas. These fish were carrying around the blueprint for every arm, every leg, every wing that would ever exist. Eusthenopteron wasn't trying to evolve limbs. It wasn't planning to walk on land someday. It was just trying to survive in the shallow, swampy waters where rivers met the sea. But those sturdy, muscular fins were perfect for pushing through thick vegetation, for maneuvering in tight spaces, for dealing with waters that were sometimes too shallow for normal swimming. And here's the incredible part: these fish could breathe air. They had to. The swampy, vegetation-choked waters where they lived were often so depleted of oxygen that gills alone weren't enough. So they developed primitive lungs as backup breathing systems. Your lungs, the ones working right now to keep you alive, are modified versions of the air bladders that first appeared in these ancient fish. But the real action was happening in the tide pools and shallow lagoons, where the chemistry of life was being rewritten with every tide. These weren't peaceful, clear pools like you might find on a modern beach. These were murky, oxygen-poor environments where only the toughest creatures could survive, and it was in these challenging conditions that evolution began its greatest experiment. Some of those lobe-finned fish started spending more and more time in the shallowest waters, places where their fins could actually touch bottom. At first, they were probably just using their fins to push themselves along the muddy bottoms of nearly dry pools. But over millions of years, those fins got stronger, more muscular, more capable of supporting weight. Meanwhile, changes were happening inside their bodies too. Their spines were getting stronger to handle the stress of gravity without water's support. Their ribs were becoming more robust to protect vital organs when they weren't floating weightlessly. Their skulls were changing shape to accommodate different ways of breathing and feeding. You have to understand, this wasn't happening quickly. We're talking about changes that took place over millions of years, tiny improvements passed down through countless generations. But the end result was revolutionary. These fish were developing the tools they'd need to leave the water entirely, and they weren't alone in this great transition. The seas were full of experimental designs, evolutionary dead ends, and incredible successes that we're still trying to understand. Every tide brought new challenges, new opportunities, new pressures that drove innovation at a pace that makes modern technology look slow. This was evolution's laboratory, and the experiments being conducted here would determine the future of life on Earth. The creatures swimming in these ancient seas weren't just living their lives, they were writing the genetic code that would eventually produce every vertebrate that ever walked, flew, or swam. So the next time you move your arm, take a breath, or feel your backbone supporting your weight, remember where it all started. 400 million years ago, in seas filled with armored monsters and experimental fish, your ancestors were learning the skills they'd need to conquer an entirely new world. But those ancestors weren't content to stay in the water forever. Something was calling them to shore, something that would change everything. And that something was green, growing, and about to transform the entire planet. You know what's amazing about revolutions? Most of the time, they start small, really small. And the green revolution that was about to change everything, I mean everything on planet Earth, started with something you could step on without even noticing. Let me take you back to those rocky shores where you were standing, gasping for breath in that alien atmosphere. While those incredible sea monsters were duking it out in the oceans, something quiet but absolutely revolutionary was happening on land. And I want you to understand just how revolutionary this was, because what I'm about to tell you changed the course of every living thing that would ever exist. It started with plants that were barely plants at all. Picture the most pathetic, scraggly moss you've ever seen clinging to the side of a damp rock. Now make it smaller, more primitive, and desperate for survival. That's basically what we're dealing with in the early Devonian. But here's the thing about evolution: it doesn't care how small or insignificant something looks. It only cares about what works. And these tiny, unimpressive plants had figured out something that would change the world. The transformation begins so slowly you'd never notice it if you were watching in real time. We're talking about changes that unfold over millions of years, tiny improvements that get passed down from one generation to the next. But by the early Devonian, some of these pioneering plants had cracked one of life's most fundamental puzzles: how to move water upward against gravity. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. When you're a plant trying to live on land, water doesn't just surround you like it does in the ocean. You have to find it, capture it, and then somehow get it from wherever you found it up to the parts of your body that need it most. For a tiny moss hugging the ground, that's not such a big deal. But what if you want to grow taller? What if you want to reach toward the sun? Enter Rhynia. And I want you to remember this name because you're looking at one of evolution's greatest innovations. Rhynia was discovered in the Rhynie Churt of Scotland back in 1912, and it was only about 8 inches tall. 8 inches! You could hide it behind a coffee cup, but inside those unassuming little stems was something that had never existed before on land: true vascular tissue. This is the breakthrough we've been waiting for. Vascular tissue is basically plant plumbing's specialized cells that form tubes capable of moving water and nutrients upward against gravity. It sounds simple when you say it like that, but this was like inventing the wheel, discovering fire, and landing on the moon all rolled into one evolutionary moment. Here's what blows my mind about the Rhynie Churt fossils. They're so well preserved that we can see individual cells. Individual cells. We can look at 400-million-year-old specimens and see exactly how these ancient plants solved the fundamental challenge of land life. It's like having a detailed instruction manual for one of evolution's greatest innovations. But Rhynia was just the beginning. Once life figured out how to build internal water highways, everything changed. And I mean everything. By the middle of the Devonian, something incredible was happening to those bare, rocky landscapes. Plants were getting taller, a lot taller. We're talking about the first trees, and these weren't your familiar oaks and maples. These were something entirely new: progymnosperms like Archaeopteris that combined features we'd never seen together before. Picture this: trees that grew 60 feet tall with fern-like leaves but wood like modern conifers. These hybrid giants were evolution experimenting with design, trying out different combinations of features to see what worked best. And the results were spectacular. Archaeopteris forests were Earth's first true forests, and stepping into one would have been like entering an alien cathedral. The trunks rose straight up like columns, their strange wood dense enough to support massive weight but flexible enough to bend in strong winds. Above you, instead of the familiar broad leaves of deciduous trees or the needles of conifers, you'd see these delicate fern-like fronds creating a canopy unlike anything that exists today. But here's where the story gets really wild. These trees weren't just changing the landscape, they were changing the entire planet. And I'm not being dramatic here. I mean they were literally reshaping the Earth's entire system, from the ground up and from the atmosphere down. Let's start with what was happening underground, because this is where the real revolution was taking place. Those root systems weren't content to just anchor the trees. They were going deep, really deep, We're talking about roots that penetrated up to 20 feet down into solid bedrock, and they weren't just sitting there passively. These roots were secreting acids, chemical warfare against stone itself. They were dissolving rock, breaking down minerals, creating soil where none had existed before. The rate of chemical weathering, that's the process where rock gets broken down by chemical reactions, increased 100-fold during the Devonian. 100-fold. Think about that for a second. For billions of years, rock weathering had proceeded at a certain steady pace. Then plants showed up, with their acid-secreting roots, and suddenly the rate at which mountains were being dissolved increased by 10,000%. These forests weren't just growing in the landscape, they were actively reshaping it, turning solid stone into the rich soil that would eventually support every ecosystem you've ever known. But the roots weren't working alone. They had partners, and these partnerships represent one of evolution's most successful collaborations ever. The roots were forming alliances with fungi mycorrhizal relationships that are still absolutely crucial today. 90% of modern plants still depend on these fungal partnerships that were first forged in the Devonian forests. Here's how it works, and it's beautiful in its simplicity. The plant provides the fungus with sugars produced by photosynthesis. In return, the fungus extends the plant's root system exponentially, creating these vast underground networks that can stretch for miles. The fungus is better at extracting nutrients from rock and soil than the plant is, so everybody wins. These partnerships turned individual trees into members of vast underground communities. Nutrients, water, even chemical signals could be shared across entire forests through fungal networks. It was like the internet, but made of living tissue and buried in the soil. Some scientists call it the Wood Wide Web, and it's been connecting forests for 400 million years. Meanwhile, above ground, something equally revolutionary was happening. These forests were sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at an unprecedented rate. Remember, when you first arrived in the Devonian, the atmosphere contained 15 times more carbon dioxide than today's air. That's what was making everything so hot and steamy. But as these forests spread across the continents, they were pulling that carbon dioxide out of the air through photosynthesis and locking it away in their woody tissues. When the trees died and got buried, that carbon stayed buried, eventually turning into coal deposits that would fuel human civilization millions of years later. The effect on global climate was dramatic. Temperatures began dropping as carbon dioxide levels plummeted. The greenhouse effect that had been keeping the planet in perpetual summer was weakening. Seasons became more pronounced. Weather patterns changed. The entire planetary climate system was being rewritten by trees. But wait, there's more. All this photosynthesis was producing oxygen as a waste product, and oxygen levels in the atmosphere were climbing steadily. Remember how you were struggling to breathe in that 15% oxygen atmosphere? Well, by the end of the Devonian, plants had boosted oxygen levels to nearly 20%, almost exactly what you're breathing right now. This wasn't just making the air more breathable for future animals. Higher oxygen levels were like adding rocket fuel to biological processes. Insects that evolved in this high oxygen environment grew to enormous sizes. We're talking about dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans, millipedes the size of alligators. It was like the entire planet was on performance-enhancing drugs. The forests were also completely transforming the water cycle. For the first time in Earth's history, you had massive amounts of plant material transpiring water vapor into the atmosphere. This created more clouds, more precipitation, more complex weather patterns. Rivers and lakes became more stable, as tree roots helped hold soil in place and regulate water flow. Let me give you a concrete example of just how dramatic this transformation was. In New York, there's a place called Gilboa, where paleontologists have uncovered an entire Devonian forest preserved exactly as it was 400 million years ago. The fossils were discovered way back in 1869, But it took more than a century before we understood what we were looking at. These Gilboa forests were dominated by trees called watieza, and they were like nothing alive today. Picture 30-foot tall trees with bulbous, swollen bases and crowns of palm-like fronds. They looked more like giant tropical plants than traditional trees, but they were creating Earth's first cathedral groves, the first places where sunlight was filtered through layers of living canopy. Walking through a watieza forest would have been an otherworldly experience. The strange, swollen trunks rising around you like organic pillars, the unfamiliar rustle of palm-like fronds overhead, the filtered green light creating patterns on the forest floor. And for the first time in Earth's history, you would have been walking on actual soil-rich, dark earth created by millions of years of decomposing plant matter and root weathering. These forests were ecological game changers in ways that are hard to overstate. They created the first complex terrestrial food webs, providing habitat and food sources for the first land animals. They stabilized riverbanks and created wetland environments that would become nurseries for evolving life. They even changed the color of the landscape from browns and grays to the green that would dominate terrestrial ecosystems forever after. But here's what I find most remarkable about this green revolution. It was completely unintentional. These plants weren't trying to change the climate or create soil or boost oxygen levels. They were just trying to survive, to find ways to capture more sunlight and access more water. Every innovation, from vascular tissue to deep root systems to partnerships with fungi, was simply a response to immediate survival challenges. Yet the cumulative effect of all these individual survival strategies was to transform Earth from a largely barren, rocky planet into something that was starting to look recognizably alive. The Devonian forests created the template for every terrestrial ecosystem that would follow. They established the basic rules for how plants and soils and climates interact. They built the foundation that would eventually support dinosaurs, mammals, and eventually us. The Green Revolution wasn't just about plants conquering land. It was about life itself learning how to reshape an entire planet to make it more hospitable to life. It was the moment when biology became geology, when living processes became powerful enough to alter the fundamental systems that govern a whole world. And the most incredible part? This was just the warm-up act. Because while the plants were busy transforming the continents, something even more revolutionary was stirring in those coastal swamps, where green met blue, where the new world of forests met the ancient realm of seas. The fish were getting ideas. Okay, so we've got these incredible forests transforming the continents, sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, creating soil where none existed before. It's like watching the planet get a complete makeover. But here's where our story takes a turn that's going to absolutely blow your mind. In the shallow, swampy margins where these new forests met the ancient seas, something desperate was happening. And I mean desperate in the best possible way, because desperation is evolution's greatest motivator. Picture these coastal environments. They're not like anything you'd recognize today. Instead of clear tidal pools or sandy beaches, you've got these murky, vegetation-choked swamps where rivers dump fresh water into salt marshes. The water levels are constantly changing with the tides, the seasons, the weather. Sometimes these areas are deep enough for fish to swim comfortably. Sometimes they're so shallow that anything bigger than a minnow gets stranded. And in these challenging, ever-changing environments, some fish were facing a simple choice: adapt or die. The fish that lived in these marginal habitats were already different from their deep-water cousins. They were tougher, more versatile, better at dealing with rapid changes in water chemistry, temperature, and depth. But the swamps were getting worse. More vegetation meant less oxygen in the water. More seasonal variation meant more frequent strandings. More competition meant that any advantage, no matter how small, could mean the difference between survival and extinction. So evolution got creative. Really creative. Let me introduce you to one of the most important creatures that ever lived. and I'm not exaggerating when I say that. Its name is Tiktaalik rosier, and that name has a beautiful story behind it. When paleontologist Neil Shubin and his team discovered this incredible fossil on Ellesmere Island in 2004, they asked the local Inuit elders what they should call it. The elders suggested Tiktaalik, which means large freshwater fish in their language. But Tiktaalik was so much more than just a large freshwater fish. This 375-million-year-old creature was evolution caught in the act of performing its greatest magic trick, turning a fin into a foot. When you look at Tiktaalik's fins, and we have beautifully preserved fossils that show incredible detail, you can see something that had never existed before. Inside those fins are bones that you'd recognize. There's a humerus, just like the bone in your upper arm. There's a radius and ulna, just like the bones in your forearm. There are even primitive wrist bones, the first tentative steps toward the complex joint that lets you bend your hand. But here's what makes Tiktaalik truly revolutionary. It had a neck. That might not sound like a big deal, but think about it. Fish don't have necks. Their heads are basically attached directly to their shoulders. If a fish wants to look in a different direction, it has to turn its entire body. But Tiktaalik could move its head independently, and that changes everything. Why? Because if you're a predator living in shallow, murky water filled with vegetation and debris, being able to move your head without moving your entire body gives you a huge advantage. You can strike at prey without telegraphing your intentions. You can look around obstacles. You can navigate tight spaces with precision. And those ribs. Tiktaalik had robust ribs that were clearly designed to support weight. In water, you don't need strong ribs because the water supports your body weight. But if you're planning to spend time in very shallow water, or heaven forbid, actually out of water entirely, you need internal scaffolding to keep your organs from being crushed by gravity. Tiktaalik also had lungs, not just primitive air sacs, but genuine lungs that could supplement its gills when oxygen levels got dangerously low. This wasn't unusual for fish living in swampy environments. Many of them had evolved some kind of air-breathing ability. But Tiktaalik's lungs were particularly well developed, suggesting it was spending significant time in oxygen-poor conditions. But here's the thing that's really going to mess with your head. Tiktaalik wasn't alone. The late Devonian swamps were full of experimental creatures, evolution's rough drafts for the ultimate transition from water to land. And some of these experiments were even more radical than Tiktaalik. Take Acanthostega, discovered in the remote mountains of Greenland. This creature was like looking at evolution's notebook, full of crossed-out ideas and experimental designs. Acanthostega had limbs, actual limbs with digits. But here's the wild part. It had 8 digits per limb. 8. Evolution hadn't settled on the 5-finger pattern that would eventually dominate. It was still experimenting with different numbers, trying to figure out what worked best. But despite having these clearly defined limbs with distinct digits, Acanthostega was still primarily aquatic. Its limbs weren't built for walking on land. They were more like underwater landing gear, perfect for maneuvering through thick vegetation and shallow, debris-filled water. The digits were more like flexible paddles than fingers, ideal for pushing through aquatic plants and getting purchase on muddy bottoms. This tells us something incredible about evolution. It doesn't have a plan. It's not working towards some predetermined goal. Acanthostega didn't evolve limbs because it was planning to walk on land someday. It evolved limbs because they helped it survive in the specific environment where it lived. The fact that those limbs would later be modified for terrestrial locomotion was just a happy accident. Then there's Ichthyostega, from the same Greenlandic fossil deposits, and this creature takes the experiment even further. Ichthyostega had limb girdles, the bone structures that attach limbs to the spine that were significantly stronger than Acanthostega's. Its rib cage was more robust, better designed to handle gravitational stress without water's support. But its hind limbs were still paddle-like, suggesting it spent considerable time in water. Looking at these creatures, you can see evolution trying out different solutions to the same basic problem: how to survive in environments that are sometimes water and sometimes land. Each species found its own unique answer, its own balance between aquatic and terrestrial adaptations. But the transition wasn't just about limbs. Oh no, it was so much more complex than that. These pioneering vertebrates had to solve dozens of engineering challenges simultaneously. First, there was the problem of breathing. Gills work great underwater, where water flows over them and oxygen can be extracted efficiently. But in air, gills collapse and become useless. So, these transitional creatures had to develop increasingly sophisticated lungs while maintaining their gills for aquatic periods. They needed dual respiratory systems, like biological submarines with both underwater and surface breathing apparatus. Then there was the problem of vision. Light behaves completely differently in air than it does in water. Eyes that work perfectly underwater produce blurry, distorted images in air. So these creatures needed to modify their visual systems, developing the first eyelids to keep their eyes from drying out and adjusting their optical systems for aerial vision. The inner ear had to be completely redesigned too. Underwater, sound travels as pressure waves through the water and into the fish's body. But in air, sound is much fainter and needs to be captured and amplified. The first tetrapods developed increasingly sophisticated middle ear structures to pick up airborne sounds and transmit them to the inner ear. And then there was the spine. Fish spines are designed to flex side to side for swimming, but they're not built to support body weight against gravity. Land animals need spines that can bear weight while still allowing flexibility for movement. The vertebrae had to be redesigned, reinforced, restructured to create a backbone that could literally be a backbone. The skin had to change too. Fish skin is designed to be permeable to allow for gas exchange with the surrounding water. But on land, permeable skin means death by dehydration. These transitional creatures had to develop increasingly waterproof skin while maintaining some ability to breathe through their skin in aquatic environments. Even the heart had to be modified. Fish hearts are designed to pump blood through gills, where it picks up oxygen before being distributed to the body. But lungs require a different circulation pattern. The heart had to develop new chambers and new pathways to efficiently pump blood to the lungs for oxygenation and then to the rest of the body. All of these changes were happening simultaneously, over millions of years, through countless small improvements passed down through generations. And the most remarkable part, every intermediate step had to be not just functional, but advantageous. Natural selection doesn't. To plan for the future, every generation had to be better adapted to its current environment than the previous generation. The process was neither quick nor easy. We're talking about 20 million years of gradual transition, from the first lobe-finned fish with strengthened fins to the first true tetrapods leaving clear footprints on muddy shores. 20 million years of experiments, dead ends, and incremental improvements. But by 365 million years ago, the breakthrough was complete. Paleontologists have found trackways, actual footprints preserved in ancient mudstones. These aren't just random marks in the rock. These are clear, parallel rows of footprints with the occasional tail drag between them. The first signatures of vertebrate life moving across dry land. Picture that moment. Somewhere on a muddy Devonian shoreline, a creature that had spent millions of years preparing for this moment took its first tentative steps onto dry ground. Maybe it was chasing prey that had washed up on shore. Maybe it was fleeing from a predator. Maybe it was just exploring, driven by the same curiosity that would eventually put footprints on the moon. But with that first step, everything changed. For the first time in Earth's history, a vertebrate was walking on land under its own power. The age of terrestrial vertebrates had begun. These pioneering tetrapods weren't trying to conquer the land. They weren't visionaries planning a terrestrial future for their descendants. They were just trying to survive in a challenging world where the line between water and land was constantly shifting. But their success in that marginal environment opened up an entirely new realm of possibility. The continents, with their new forests and rich soils, were waiting, and life was finally equipped with the tools it needed to claim them. But success, as we're about to discover, comes with a price. The very innovations that made terrestrial life possible were about to trigger one of the most devastating crises in Earth's history. You know what they say about the best laid plans? Well, evolution doesn't make plans, but if it did, the late Devonian would have been the moment when everything went spectacularly wrong. Picture this. We've got forests spreading across the continents, transforming bare rock into rich soil. We've got the first vertebrates taking their tentative steps onto land. We've got coral reefs covering more of the ocean floor than they ever had before or ever would again. By every measure, life was winning. Life was thriving. Life had never been more diverse, more innovative, or more successful, and that success was about to kill almost everything. What I'm about to tell you is one of the most tragic and ironic stories in the history of life on Earth. The very innovations that made the Devonian such a spectacular period of evolutionary advancement were also setting the stage for one of the most devastating mass extinctions our planet has ever seen. The catastrophe didn't announce itself with dramatic flair. There was no asteroid screaming out of the sky, no massive volcanic eruption that blocked out the Sunday. Instead, the late Devonian extinction crept up slowly, quietly, like a poison spreading through the world's bloodstream. And by the time anyone, if there had been anyone around to notice, realized what was happening, it was far too late to stop it. The crisis began around 375 million years ago, with something scientists call the Kellwasser event. And right away, that name should tell you something, because Kellwasser literally means cellar water. In German, it's named after these dark, stagnant-looking rock layers that German geologists found in their basement-like limestone quarries. These black layers are like a geological obituary, recording the death of an ocean. But here's what makes the Kellwasser event so insidious. It didn't happen all at once. Instead, it unfolded in two separate pulses of destruction, separated by about 100,000 years. Imagine if someone was trying to kill you, and they poisoned you twice, just to make sure the job was done properly. That's essentially what happened to the Devonian world. The first pulse hit like a slow-motion apocalypse. Ocean temperatures began plummeting not gradually, but dramatically. We're talking about a 13-degree Fahrenheit drop in ocean temperatures. That might not sound like much, but remember, these were global average temperatures. 13 degrees is the difference between a world where coral reefs thrive and a world where they freeze to death. And here's the kicker. This wasn't caused by some external catastrophe. This was life destroying itself through its own success. Remember all those magnificent forests we talked about? Those towering Archaeopteris trees with their deep root systems and their partnership with fungi? They were busy sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at an unprecedented rate, and I mean unprecedented. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels plummeted from about 4,000 parts per million to near modern levels, a 90% reduction. Now, in the long term, this was great for the planet. It made the climate more stable, more hospitable for future life. But in the short term, it was a disaster. All that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere hadn't just been sitting there doing nothing. It had been keeping the planet warm through the greenhouse effect. Remove that much greenhouse gas that quickly, and you get runaway cooling. The cooling triggered a cascade of catastrophic events. Ice sheets began forming at the poles for the first time in millions of years. Ocean currents changed as temperature gradients shifted. Weather patterns went haywire. And most devastatingly of all, Cold water can't hold as much dissolved oxygen as warm water, so as the oceans cooled, they began suffocating. But wait, there's more. And by more, I mean worse, much worse. All that rock weathering we talked about, those tree roots breaking down bedrock and creating soil, was having unintended consequences. The roots weren't just creating soil, they were releasing massive amounts of nutrients into the water cycle. Every time it rained, these nutrients washed into rivers and streams and eventually into the oceans. Under normal circumstances, this might have been a good thing. Extra nutrients mean more food for marine life, right? Wrong. What actually happened was like giving a diabetic a candy bar the size of a refrigerator. The nutrient-rich runoff triggered massive algae blooms across the world's oceans. And when I say massive, I mean oceanic dead zones that stretched across entire continental shelves. These algae blooms were like underwater forest fires, consuming everything in their path. Here's how it worked, and it's terrifyingly simple. The algae would bloom explosively, covering vast areas of the ocean surface. Then, just as quickly as they'd appeared, they'd die en masse. Billions upon billions of dead algae cells would sink to the ocean floor, where bacteria would decompose them. And that decomposition process consumed oxygen, lots of oxygen. The result was anoxia, ocean waters so depleted of oxygen that nothing could survive in them. Fish suffocated, shellfish died in their shells. Entire ecosystems collapsed as the very foundation of the food web was poisoned by its own abundance. The evidence for this catastrophe is written in rocks around the world. From Germany to New York, from China to Australia, geologists find these distinctive black shale layers, rocks formed in oxygen-starved seas, where nothing could live and organic matter couldn't decay properly. These black layers are like grave markers, memorializing the death of an ocean. And the victims? Oh, the victims were heartbreaking. The coral reefs that had covered more area than any time before or since vanished so completely that it would take 14 million years for reefs to recover. 14 million years. To put that in perspective, 14 million years ago, your ancestors were still living in trees and had barely figured out how to walk upright. The mighty placoderms, those armored fish that had ruled the seas for 50 million years, lost 70% of their species. Dunkleosteus, that 33-foot apex predator we met earlier, became extinct forever. The age of armored fish was ending not with the roar of battle, but with the whimper of suffocation. Trilobites, those incredible arthropods with their sophisticated compound eyes and endless variety of forms, never recovered their former diversity. They'd survived every previous crisis Earth had thrown at them, but the late Devonian broke them. They limped on for another 100 million years, but they were living fossils, echoes of their former glory. Even the brachiopods, those shell creatures that had carpeted the seafloor like underwater meadows, were decimated. 75% of brachiopod species vanished, leaving vast empty spaces where thriving communities had once filtered nutrients from the water. But the Kellwasser event was just the first act of this tragedy. The second pulse of extinction came 100,000 years later, and if anything, it was even worse than the first. By then, life had had a chance to recover slightly from the first catastrophe. Some species had adapted to the new conditions. Some ecosystems had found new equilibria. Hope was returning to the Devonian world, and then the second hammer fell. This time the crisis was triggered by a different mechanism, but the result was the same: massive oceanic anoxia and widespread extinction. The survivors of the first pulse found themselves facing a second round of environmental collapse, and many species that had weathered the first storm couldn't survive the second. But even that wasn't the end of the story. The coup de grace came with the Hangenberg event 359 million years ago, right at the boundary between the Devonian and the following Carboniferous period. The Hangenberg event was possibly triggered by massive volcanism in Siberia, combined with continued climate cooling and oceanic chemistry changes. But by this point, marine ecosystems were so weakened by the previous crises that they couldn't absorb any more damage. The final tally was devastating. 75% of all species vanished. 3/4 of everything that lived on Earth gone. The diversity that had taken hundreds of millions of years to accumulate was wiped out in a geological instant. And here's the most tragic part. It was all completely avoidable. If the forests had spread more slowly, if the cooling had been more gradual, if the nutrient runoff had been less concentrated, the crisis might never have happened. Life's greatest triumph became its greatest disaster. But here's something that's going to really mess with your head. This wasn't a failure of evolution. This was evolution working exactly as it's supposed to work. Every species was doing what it needed to do to survive and thrive in its immediate environment. The trees were spreading because that's what trees do. The root systems were deepening because deeper roots meant better access to water and nutrients. The reefs were expanding because that's what successful ecosystems do. Nobody planned for the consequences. Evolution doesn't plan. It just responds to immediate pressures, one generation at a time. The fact that these individual adaptations would eventually trigger a global catastrophe was completely unpredictable and entirely unintended. This is one of the most important lessons the Devonian teaches us. Success can be its own worst enemy. The innovations that make life more successful in the short term can create conditions that make life impossible in the long term. The very traits that help species thrive can ultimately threaten their survival. It's a lesson that resonates today as we face our own climate crisis. Like the Devonian forests, we're modifying our planet's atmospheric chemistry faster than natural systems can adapt. Like those ancient reefs, we're creating conditions that could trigger cascading ecological collapses. The parallels are uncomfortable and unavoidable. But here's the thing about extinction events. They're not the end of the story. They're transitions. They're opportunities for life to explore new possibilities, to try out innovations that might never have succeeded in a crowded, stable world. The late Devonian extinction cleared out ecological niches that had been occupied for millions of years. With the armored fish gone, sharks were free to diversify into every available marine niche. Some evolved into bottom feeders. Others became open ocean cruisers. Still others specialized in hunting in shallow coastal waters. The basic shark body plan was so efficient that it could be modified for almost any marine lifestyle. On land, the first amniotes vertebrates that could lay eggs away from water were just beginning to appear. These early reptiles were small and relatively insignificant during the Devonian, but with the ecological disruption caused by the extinction, they had new opportunities to expand and diversify. The plants that survived the crisis were the ones best adapted to the new, cooler world. Seed plants began to dominate over spore plants. Conifers started their rise to prominence. The stage was being set for the great coal forests of the Carboniferous, the age of giant insects, and eventually the age of reptiles. In the oceans, new types of coral began to evolve, building reefs in ways that had never been tried before. New kinds of shell creatures moved into the vacant niches left by the extinct brachiopods. The marine ecosystem began rebuilding itself from the ground up, incorporating hard-learned lessons about stability and resilience. The late Devonian extinction was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, but it was also a reset button for life on Earth. It cleared away old established patterns and created space for new experiments, new innovations, new ways of being alive. And perhaps most importantly, it taught life an invaluable lesson about the dangers of its own success. The survivors were the species that had learned to live within their means, that had found ways to thrive without destabilizing the very systems they depended on. It's a lesson that took 350 million years to learn, and one that we're still learning today. Here's something that's going to blow your mind. Everything I've just told you about the Devonian period, Every detail about those incredible sea monsters, those pioneering forests, those first tentative steps onto land, all of it was completely unknown just 200 years ago. Think about that for a second. In 1825, nobody knew that Dunkley Osteus had ever existed. Nobody knew that the first forests had fundamentally changed Earth's climate. Nobody had any idea that fish had once crawled out of the sea and learned to walk. The entire 400 million year story of the Devonian period was locked away in rocks, waiting for someone clever enough to figure out how to read the stone library that surrounded us. And the person who started cracking that code was a Scottish stonemason named Hugh Miller, who probably never imagined he'd become one of the most important scientists of his generation. Picture this. It's the 1830s, and Hugh Miller is spending his days splitting rocks in Scotland's old red sandstone quarries. He's not a trained geologist, he's just a working man with curious eyes and a knack for noticing things that other people miss. But as he's breaking open these ancient rocks, he keeps finding things that don't make sense. Strange shapes embedded in stone, creatures that look like fish, but fish unlike anything swimming in Scottish rivers, massive jawbones with no teeth, just sharp ridges of bone, armor plating that belonged to something that looked like it crawled out of a nightmare. Miller started collecting these bizarre fossils, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. And remember, this was before Darwin published On the Origin of Species. People didn't have a framework for understanding that life had evolved over millions of years. The prevailing belief was that all creatures had been created in their current forms, and that the Earth itself was only a few thousand years old. But Miller was looking at evidence that the world had once been populated by creatures so strange, so unlike anything alive today, that they challenged everything people thought they knew about the history of life. In 1841, Miller published a book called The Old Red Sandstone, and it caused a sensation. Here was a working-class stonemason describing incredible armoured fish that had ruled ancient seas, backed up by detailed illustrations and careful observations. Victorian drawing rooms buzzed with excitement as people tried to imagine seas populated by these bizarre creatures. Miller's book did something unprecedented. It brought deep time to the general public. For the first time, ordinary people could envision a world that existed long before humans, populated by creatures so alien they might as well have come from another planet. But Miller wasn't working in isolation. Around the same time, two other geologists were engaged in a fierce debate that would eventually give the Devonian period its name. Adam Sedgwick and Roderick Murchison were trying to organize the rock layers of Devon, England, into a coherent timeline. They were finding rock formations that clearly didn't fit into the existing geological periods that had already been defined. These Devon rocks contained fossils that were clearly older than the Carboniferous period but younger than the Silurian. They represented a distinct chapter in Earth's history that deserved its own name, hence Devonian, named after the English county where the puzzle was first recognized. But here's the thing about those early geologists. They were working with incomplete tools. They could arrange rock layers in relative order. This layer is older than that one, but they had no way of putting absolute dates on anything. They could tell you that the Devonian came after the Silurian and before the Carboniferous, but they couldn't tell you when the Devonian actually happened or how long it lasted. That all changed in the 20th century with the discovery of radiometric dating. Suddenly, scientists could measure the decay of radioactive elements in rocks and put actual numbers on geological time. The Devonian period, they discovered, lasted from 419 to 359 million years ago, 60 million years of Earth history that had been completely invisible to previous generations. But even with absolute dates, the story of the Devonian remained frustratingly incomplete. Fossils are rare things, formed only under very specific conditions. For every creature that gets fossilized, millions more disappear without leaving any trace. Scientists were working with a jigsaw puzzle, where 99% of the pieces were missing. The breakthrough came with new techniques that revolutionized paleontology. Mass spectrometry allowed scientists to analyze the chemical composition of ancient shells and bones, revealing information about temperatures, atmospheric composition, and ocean chemistry that had been preserved for hundreds of millions of years. CT scanning meant that paleontologists could peer inside fossils without destroying them. Suddenly, they could see the internal structures of ancient creatures, understanding how their organs were arranged, how their brains were organized, how their muscles attached to their bones. It was like having X-ray vision that could see through time. But the real breakthroughs came from painstaking fieldwork, and some of the most important discoveries were made by people willing to travel to the most remote and challenging places on Earth. Take Jennifer Clack, for instance. In the 1980s, she was making expeditions to Greenland, hiking across frozen tundra, and camping in temperatures that could kill you if your equipment failed. She was following up on earlier discoveries of Devonian fossils in Greenland's remote mountain ranges, places so isolated that getting there required military transport and survival skills. But what Clack found in those frozen rocks revolutionized our understanding of how vertebrates made the transition from water to land. Her discoveries of creatures like Acanthostega and Ichthyostega showed that the evolution of limbs was far more complex and experimental than anyone had imagined. Before Clack's work, scientists thought the evolution of tetrapods followed a simple linear progression. Fish developed stronger fins, then primitive limbs, then more sophisticated limbs, then they walked onto land. But Clack's fossils showed that evolution was actually trying out dozens of different approaches simultaneously. Some early tetrapods had 8 digits per limb, others had 7. Some had limbs but were still fully aquatic. Others could probably walk on land but still had tails designed for swimming. Evolution was experimenting with every possible combination of aquatic and terrestrial features, trying to find solutions to the challenge of living in both environments. And then there was Per Ahlberg's incredible discovery in Poland in 2010. Ahlberg and his team found trackways, actual footprints, that were 10 million years older than the oldest tetrapod body fossils. This meant that vertebrates were walking on land much earlier than anyone had thought possible. These Polish trackways were like finding evidence of a crime that nobody knew had been committed. Somewhere, somehow, there were tetrapods advanced enough to walk on land 10 million years before Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, but we had no body fossils of these early pioneers. They remained ghosts in the fossil record, known only by the tracks they left behind. Meanwhile, other paleontologists were making equally revolutionary discoveries about Devonian marine life. The Cleveland Shale in Ohio turned out to be one of the richest sources of Devonian fossils in the world. The rocks there preserve an entire ecosystem in incredible detail, not just the bones of ancient creatures, but soft tissues, stomach contents, even evidence of predator-prey relationships. One Cleveland Shale fossil shows a Dunkleosteus that died with a 14-foot shark stuck in its throat. Another preserves a primitive shark with its last meal still visible in its stomach. These fossils don't just tell us what these creatures looked like, they tell us how they lived, what they ate, how they interacted with each other. But perhaps the most important breakthrough came with the development of molecular clocks techniques that use genetic differences between modern species to estimate when their ancestors diverged from each other. Here's how it works. All living things accumulate random genetic mutations at a fairly steady rate. By comparing the genetic differences between closely related species and calibrating those differences against fossil evidence, scientists can estimate how long ago those species shared a common ancestor. What molecular clocks revealed about the Devonian was stunning. Many of the genetic innovations that we see in modern vertebrates actually evolved much earlier than the fossil record suggested. The genetic toolkit for building limbs, for breathing air, for living on land, all of this existed long before the first tetrapod left its footprints on a muddy shore. This means that evolution was preparing for the transition to terrestrial life millions of years before it actually happened. The genetic machinery was already in place. It just needed the right environmental pressures to activate it. Modern paleontologists are also using increasingly sophisticated techniques to extract information from fossils. Electron microscopy can reveal cellular structures preserved for hundreds of millions of years. Chemical analysis can detect traces of original organic molecules, including pigments that tell us what colors these ancient creatures were. We now know, for instance, that some Devonian fish had sophisticated color patterns for camouflage or display. We can determine what plants ancient herbivores were eating by analyzing the chemical signatures preserved in their teeth. We can even reconstruct ancient food webs by studying the ratios of different isotopes in fossil bones. But perhaps the most remarkable development has been the ability to study entire ancient ecosystems rather than just individual species. The Gilboa Forest in New York, discovered in 1869, has been re-excavated using modern techniques that preserve not just individual trees, but their spatial relationships to each other. Scientists can now map entire ancient forests, showing how different species were distributed, how they competed for resources, how they modified their local environment. It's like having a time machine that can take you back to walk through a 400-million-year-old forest. The Rhynie Chert in Scotland has provided even more detailed preservation. Hot spring deposits there have preserved not just plant structures but individual cells, complete with organelles. We can see how photosynthesis worked in the first vascular plants, how their water transport systems functioned, even how they defended themselves against fungal infections. All of these discoveries have transformed our understanding of the Devonian from a simple story about the age of fishes into a complex narrative about one of the most revolutionary periods in Earth's history. We now know that the Devonian wasn't just about fish evolving limbs, it was about the entire planet transforming from a largely aquatic world into one where terrestrial life was possible. The irony is that the more we learn about the Devonian, the more we realize how much we still don't know. Every new fossil discovery raises new questions. Every new technique reveals new mysteries. The ancient world becomes more complex and more fascinating the more closely we examine it. And that's the beauty of science. It's not about finding final answers. It's about asking better questions. The stonemason Hugh Miller couldn't have imagined CT scanners or molecular clocks or electron microscopy, but his willingness to look carefully at strange shapes in stone started a chain of curiosity that continues today. Every rock you walk past might contain the fossil of a creature that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. Every limestone cliff might hold evidence of ancient reefs that supported ecosystems more diverse than anything alive today. The story of life on Earth is written in stone all around us, waiting for someone curious enough to learn how to read it. The Devonian period was hidden in plain sight for millions of human lifetimes before we developed the tools and techniques to recognize it. Who knows what other stories are still waiting to be discovered? What other chapters of Earth's history are still locked away in rocks, waiting for the next Hugh Miller to come along and crack the code? You know what's amazing? Right now, as you're listening to this, you're living proof that the Devonian period actually happened. Every breath you take, every step you walk, every time you bend your wrist or turn your head, you're using innovations that were first developed 400 million years ago in those alien seas and primitive forests we've been exploring together. Let me start with something as simple as breathing. Take a deep breath right now. Feel your lungs expanding, drawing air into your body, extracting life-giving oxygen from the atmosphere. Those lungs exist because some desperate lobe-finned fish in an oxygen-poor Devonian swamp developed air bladders as backup breathing systems. Your ability to survive in air instead of water is a direct inheritance from creatures that were just trying to make it through another day in a harsh and changing world. And it's not just breathing. Hold up your hand and look at it. Count your fingers. 5 digits, right? That specific number, 5 fingers, 5 toes, isn't random. It's not some mathematical perfect that evolution was aiming for. That pattern stabilized during the Devonian experiments with early tetrapods. Remember Acanthostega with its 8 digits per limb, or other early tetrapods that tried 6, 7, even more. Evolution was experimenting with different numbers, trying to figure out what worked best. But somehow, 5 became the standard, the number that provided the best balance of strength, dexterity, and efficiency. Every time you write, type, play piano, or wave hello, you're using a design that was perfected in Devonian swamps. Your spine tells the same story. Feel the back of your neck. Trace your backbone down to your lower back. That structure vertebrae that lock together for support while still allowing flexibility was engineered during those first tentative ventures onto land. Fish spines are built for side-to-side swimming motion, but land animals need spines that can bear weight while still permitting movement. Your backbone is a Devonian innovation, refined over millions of years but fundamentally unchanged from its ancient origins. But the connections between you and the Devonian run much deeper than anatomy. They run to the very foundations of the world you live in. That morning coffee you had, the plant that produced those beans depends on a symbiotic relationship with mycorrhizal fungi that was first forged in Devonian forest soils. 90% of modern plants still rely on these fungal partnerships that began 400 million years ago. The roots of coffee plants, just like the roots of those ancient Archaeopteris trees, trade sugars with fungi in exchange for nutrients and water. It's the same deal, the same partnership, just updated for modern crops. The coal that powered the Industrial Revolution, that came from Devonian and Carboniferous forests. Those towering trees with their deep root systems and woody tissues eventually died, got buried, and transformed over millions of years into the fossil fuels that built modern civilization. Every time someone flipped a light switch in a coal-powered city, they were accessing solar energy that had been captured by Devonian photosynthesis and stored underground for hundreds of millions of years. Even the soil in your garden carries echoes of the Devonian Green Revolution. Before those first forests, soil was basically just weathered rock. But the combination of deep tree roots, acid secretion, and fungal partnerships created the rich, complex soils that make modern agriculture possible. The Iowa cornfield, the California vineyard, the backyard tomato garden, they're all built on innovations that first appeared in Devonian forests. And speaking of climate, the lessons of the Devonian period are more relevant today than ever before. Climate scientists studying our current environmental crisis regularly look back to the Devonian as a case study in how biological processes can rapidly alter planetary systems. The Devonian demonstrates both the power of life to transform a planet and the dangers of those transformations happening too quickly. Those ancient forests sucked carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere so effectively that they triggered ice ages and mass extinctions. Today, we're running the experiment in reverse, pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere faster than natural systems can absorb it. The parallels are uncomfortable but undeniable. Like the Devonian forests, we're modifying our planet's atmospheric chemistry at a pace that ecosystems can't adapt to. Like those ancient reefs that covered unprecedented areas before vanishing entirely, we're creating conditions that could trigger cascading ecological collapses. But the Devonian also teaches us about resilience and recovery. Life didn't end with the late Devonian extinction. It transformed. It adapted. It found new ways to thrive in a changed world. The survivors were the species that had learned to live within their environmental means, that had developed strategies for dealing with rapid change. The sharks that survived the Devonian extinction went on to diversify into every available marine niche. The basic shark body plan was so efficient, so adaptable, that it could be modified for almost any lifestyle. Today's great whites, hammerheads, and whale sharks are all descendants of Devonian survivors, proof that sometimes the best strategy for dealing with catastrophic change is to perfect a design that's fundamentally sound. The first amniotes, those early reptiles that could lay eggs away from water, were barely significant during the Devonian, but when the extinction cleared out ecological niches and created new opportunities, they were ready. They had the right tools for the job: waterproof eggs, efficient lungs, strong skeletons. The age of reptiles, and eventually the age of mammals, grew from seeds planted in Devonian soil. Perhaps most importantly, the Devonian teaches us about the unintended consequences of success. The innovations that made life more successful in the short term, forests, root systems, efficient carbon cycling, created long-term problems that threatened life's continued existence. It's a lesson about the difference between local optimization and global stability. This has profound implications for how we think about our own, the relationship with the planet. Every innovation, every technological advance, every solution to an immediate problem has the potential to create new problems down the line. The Devonian reminds us that we need to think systemically, to consider how our actions affect not just our immediate environment, but the planetary systems that support all life. But there's also something deeply hopeful about the Devonian story. It shows us that life is incredibly resilient, incredibly creative, incredibly good at finding new solutions to seemingly impossible problems. The fish that learn to breathe air, the plants that learn to live on land, the ecosystems that rebuilt themselves after near-total collapse, they all demonstrate life's amazing capacity for innovation and recovery. Evolution doesn't plan for the future, but it does prepare for it. The genetic toolkit for terrestrial life existed long before the first tetrapod walked on land. The biochemical machinery for complex multicellular life was perfected long before it was needed. Evolution creates possibilities and holds them in reserve, waiting for the right moment, the right environmental pressure, the right opportunity. Today, as we face our own environmental challenges, we can take inspiration from the Devonian pioneers. Like those first plants colonizing bare rock, like those first vertebrates exploring an alien landscape, we're dealing with unprecedented conditions that require innovative solutions. The difference is that we have something those ancient pioneers didn't have: consciousness. We can learn from the past, plan for the future, and make choices based on more than just immediate survival needs. We can look at the Devonian extinction and understand how biological success can lead to environmental catastrophe. We can study the recovery and learn how resilience and adaptation work. Most importantly, we can recognize that we're not separate from the natural world, we're part of it. Our success is tied to the health of the planetary systems that support all life. The Devonian teaches us that there's no such thing as isolated success, that everything is connected to everything else. When you walk outside tomorrow morning and take a breath of fresh air, remember that you're participating in atmospheric cycles that were fundamentally shaped by Devonian forests. When you step confidently across uneven ground, remember that you're using locomotive systems perfected by creatures brave enough to leave the safety of ancient seas. When you face uncertainty or challenge in your own life, remember that you're descended from pioneers who survived the transition from water to land, who endured mass extinctions, who rebuilt entire ecosystems from scratch. That same adaptability, that same resilience, that same capacity for innovation lives in every cell of your body. The Devonian period ended 359 million years ago, but its legacy continues in every forest, every breath, every footstep. You are not just a witness to natural history, you are natural history, a living continuation of stories that began in ancient seas and primitive forests. The next time you look at a tree, remember that you're seeing the descendants of the first forests that dared to challenge bare rock. The next time you watch waves crash against a shore, remember that similar waves once carried the first vertebrates toward their terrestrial destiny. And the next time someone tells you that the distant past has nothing to do with your daily life, remember this: you are carrying 400 million years of evolutionary innovation in your bones, your breath, your DNA. You are proof that life finds a way, that change is possible, that even the most alien worlds can become home. The Devonian period was just one chapter in the ongoing story of life on Earth, but it was the chapter that made all the subsequent chapters possible, including the one you're writing right now. With every choice you make, every breath you take, every step you walk into an uncertain but possibility-filled future. The ancient world isn't dead and gone. It lives on in you, in the ground beneath your feet, in the air you breathe. You are the Devonians' greatest success story, 400 million years in the making, still writing new chapters in the grand adventure of life on Earth. Thanks for taking this incredible journey with me through deep time. Until next time, keep exploring, keep wondering, and remember you're more connected to this ancient world than you ever imagined.